So today is JavaScript, which is the final language we'll get to tack on along with HTML and CSS. And these three languages combined make up most of websites. That's the kind of the minimum you need to make a useful website. You obviously can make a website with just HTML like we saw in class 1, but if you want some style, and we'll see what we can do today with JavaScript. If you want anything we can do today with JavaScript, you need that language as well. But this is kind of the base trio of languages that you need. So in week 1, we did HTML, which is content and kind of the meaning, the metadata behind what the content is. Like we have a heading, we have a title, we have a link tag. We know what the content is, and things like Chrome and websites can then do automatic things to do stuff with that data, and things like accessibility tools. And this is what HTML looks like on its own. It's kind of plain text on a page plus some images, kind of full size. But then when you add in the CSS, you can take all this plain stuff just kind of stacked up like that. And you can get a really cool thing with all types of layout and dynamic resizing with CSS at that point. And we even see you can do like hover effects with CSS. We saw last time you can do animations, the mobile responsiveness. That's all CSS. But JavaScript today is going to be it's the ability to manipulate that existing HTML and CSS in response to something someone does on a website. Click a button, move the mouse some way, things like that. So if we look on this website, this hover effect, that's CSS. But something like this, when you actually change the content of the website, we click on something and the page kind of changes substantially. That's JavaScript. This kind of button that you can go like this is also JavaScript. If we go to a web page like this, which I'll mention at the end of class again if we have time, because it has all the coding free websites that you can go to study up on these languages. But if we take a look at this website, one, again, this kind of movement is CSS. But if we take a look, Python coding is highlighted, and we see Python coding, and we see a little bit at the bottom of the page, but we don't see this stuff about Microsoft and Google, and we don't see the stuff about web development. But if we go ahead and click on these boxes, we can see this changes. And now this middle content has swapped out the Python coding with website development. Same thing if we click on this. And again, same if we click with this. This is all JavaScript, changing HTML and CSS, substantially changing the page based on how we interact with the website. That's the main focus of today, just manipulating HTML, CSS. But JavaScript can do a lot of things beyond those kind of manipulations. It's kind of a full-size programming language like HTML and CSS, so not quite. They both do quite specific things, and they have quite simple syntax relative to the JavaScript we'll see today. But JavaScript can, in addition to this, it can do things like any type of math, science, calculations, all stuff like that. It can execute commands based on logic, like if X, then Y, else Z. HTML and CSS don't really have that built in, but with JavaScript, we can do that. And we can also make data, hold on to data, and then manipulate it. So we can put in like what's called text strings, just hold on to a bunch of text. We can put in amounts, so we could do, again, calculations with money, with stuff like that. We could do dates and do dates calculations, things like that. So JavaScript is a full programming language. You could even make video games. You could build AIs, do APIs, lots of fancy and complicated stuff with JavaScript. So it's definitely the biggest language of all the three that we looked at yet. Just on the way in. Just want to again talk about static and dynamic websites. So a static website is basically anyone who goes to the website gets the same non-customized page. So like something with the library website, everybody goes to it and they see the same content. But what a dynamic website is it's something that you might log into, like Facebook. Facebook, you log into it, and anyone who logs into it gets a profile page, but the content on that page is unique to who's logged in at that moment, which list of friends they have, the messages they got, photos and things like that. So that is what a dynamic website is. And that needs what's called a back end and needs what's called a database, kind of a private thing that only the company has access to. And that's what holds all that private info and then builds the website as you log in and interact with it that way. So while JavaScript can do some of those things with dynamic websites, help interact with the database and things, in this class, obviously, we won't be dealing with that. We'll be dealing with its most simple applications, just relative to a static website. Okay, so how can JavaScript kind of manipulate HTML and CSS? The ability comes from what's called the DOM, which is the Document Object Model. And that's basically, so when I just hop into CodePen, all along the way, we've been, each class, we've been doing one type of file. We began with an HTML file, a CSS file. Today, we'll be doing a JavaScript file. Those build a website. And then when someone accesses that website, they get a copy of those files, and then all combined, HTML combined with CSS, combined with JavaScript if you have it, you get kind of a new object called the DOM, which is all of them combined. And that's how JavaScript can interact with the website. This is kind of what the DOM might look like. You have the document at the kind of top level, which is just kind of the website. We know that in HTML, the topmost nesting element is just that HTML element. Everything has to go inside of that. And then we looked a little bit about head, but we mostly looked at body. And then from then on, everything is just nested inside something else like this. So this tree-like view of HTML, we can imagine the CSS is kind of tagged into each element that it's applied to. There's a whole big tree of elements, each of those elements with a lot of data about them, text content, style, JavaScript stuff. This whole thing is the document object model, and that's what we'll be looking at today. And so we'll be able to get, when we want to interact with something on the page, we have to identify what we want to get and identify, if someone clicks a button, we need to be able to get that button. So JavaScript knows that button has been clicked. And then we have to get something else on the page so that we can make a change to it. So that's what we mean by get. And then once we've gotten something, we can change the style of those things. And we can even add totally new HTML elements. And we can delete HTML elements out of the DOM if we'd like. And we'll see examples of all of these as we go along. But this is kind of a general view of what we'll be taking a look at. Today, I gave us all the template file. So we won't be taking too close a look at the HTML that I gave us. But we can see if you haven't taken too close a look at it, we have a lot of new HTML elements that we didn't take a look at in the HTML class. I kind of skipped this whole group of elements. And I skipped those because we would be coming to them today. And those elements we skipped all have to do with kind of inputting data to a website. Anytime you go to a website and it asks you to log in, or to input some information if you were paying to buy an item, things like that. All of those things are quite handy when it comes to JavaScript. So that's why we saved it to today. But essentially, all the things we'll be looking at today, the HTML of it, it's kind of like table. We have a nesting element that kind of holds all of these buttons and clickable things inside of them, called a form like this. And then we have kind of input fields, and that's just called the input element. And the input element can take a lot of types of things. You can put like text into it. You can even have a color picking input type. You can have like a slide like this. You can have like a drop down like this. You can have like checkboxes, all kinds of things. And that uses the type attribute. So if you want to take a look at the actual HTML, I've linked to W3 schools. And you can see again, all this input type. But if we take a look at some of the examples, we have like name fields. We have like a password field, so it blocks out what you type in. We have things like submit buttons, radio buttons, this kind of thing, pick one. And kind of the opposite of that, we have checkboxes when you can click multiple at a time. All types of things like that. Not too difficult to build up, as you can see. You just enclose it in the nesting element, and then you just have an input and select the type like this. So I just want to give a little background to the HTML that we have, but the page itself is quite simple. I've just divvied it up into a couple of divs, each of these boxes, and then we just have a couple inputs that make up each box, and we'll be doing something with each of those. Okay, so we can go ahead and hop into CodePen itself today. We won't be adding any HTML, CSS, so we can just pull up the JavaScript pane like that if you want. If you don't know how to make the page like this, you can change the view of the website by clicking on this little layout button up at the top. But let's talk a little bit about JavaScript. It's a whole new language, so we need some new syntax and things like that. So let's just begin. We know with HTML and CSS, we had that comment ability. This was an HTML comment. This was a CSS comment. JavaScript also has comments. And again, a comment is just something that's not really code. It's just kind of a note to you, but it doesn't show up on the website. It's not read in as code. It won't mess anything up. So in JavaScript, we have two types of comment. We have a double slash, and we can do it like that. But then if we want to do a multi-line comment, anything in between these two slashes and asterisks like this, we can do a multi-line comment like that. So we can use these to, put notes on the JavaScript file as we go along like this. In JavaScript, we don't just have simple syntax like the HTML and CSS. We have a lot of logic. We can do math. We can do code commands and statements. We can write functions, all types of things like that. So in JavaScript, we might have a function that looks like this. And anytime you see a name and then parentheses behind it, that usually means it's a function. And we'll talk about what a function is in a second. But one last thing we want to know about JavaScript is that the semicolon is kind of the punctuation of JavaScript. Most lines end in a semicolon. That kind of says that statement is done, and then we can jump to a new line and do a new statement that way. So let's use just a built-in JavaScript function. A function is just something that does something, usually given some input, something that you give it. And one of the simplest things is a little pop-up message. So I can do something like this. And we can see anytime I reload the page now, I get that pop-up at the top. And something else to know about JavaScript, just like HTML and CSS, this is read by, in this case, Chrome as soon as you load up a website. And all of these statements and commands and functions kind of get executed top to bottom like this as soon as you load the page. So that's why this shows up immediately as soon as I update the page. So we can go ahead and comment that out. But let's take a look at something else. That one is kind of annoying. It kind of pops up in the middle of the page and kind of stops you from doing anything else. So instead of doing that, we can use a function called console.log. We can just put any message we want inside the parentheses, inside quotations. We'll end in a semicolon to signify the end of it. And this is going to send a message to the console. And we see, unlike this one, nothing actually happened. But what we can do now, and I've mentioned this kind of quickly the last two classes, so we might not have noticed, but we have access to the inspect element. And this gives us access to the dev tools on Chrome, on Mozilla, Edge, any web browser that you use. So if you just right click any place on the page, and usually down at the bottom, you'll see something like inspect element. If you go ahead and click on that, we see a whole new bunch of windows pop up. We still have the website, but then this pane on the side, let me resize it, is all the web development tools that Chrome gives us access to. So we see up at the top, we have elements highlighted, and it's kind of confusing at the moment, but then if we take a look, we begin to notice as we put the mouse on top of things, things on the page highlight. We see div ID equals demo, and then we see demo box as the content. And that seems to be the HTML of this website itself. And this is what the inspect dev tool is. When you access a website, you basically download a copy of the files. You build up that document object model, the HTML, CSS combined. And then this is how you can access kind of the code itself. This is the same as the displayed website based on CSS and HTML, but this is just kind of the code behind it, which we do have access to, which you may not have seen in the past. So we have access to the HTML. If you look at the bottom, if I click on elements down at the bottom, it displays my styles. So I have my HTML. Then I have my styles down this way. So any website that you want to go to and you want to click on something, say I want to find the CSS of this J, well, I can see this is the exact shade of yellow it is. This is the font size. You know, this is the text shadow, and we can even manipulate it by clicking on and off things, and we can add CSS. But let's go ahead and move on to the JavaScript after this. We see the HTML and the CSS. If we go to the console, we can see finally that message that we sent to the console. So this is logging a message to this console. And this is kind of, among many things to us, it's just kind of a debugging tool. We can print things to this kind of behind the scenes to see what's going on in JavaScript. And we'll see why it's useful as we go on with the class. But right now, we can just send a simple message to it and find it in the console like that. Minimize this a little bit. Okay, so that's a simple function and some simple syntax. Also in JavaScript, we can do things like creating a data object. So we could say, let's make a new object. We'll say let x, we'll just call this object x, equal 10. So we just have an object, kind of like a box called x. And inside of that is the quantity 10. We'll slap on that semicolon. And then we could do something like, let's send that pop-up message again. And then we can see x, whose value is 10, pops up when we use the pop-up function like that. So we'll make a couple data objects today. Data object is just a box that has some specific value. And we can change the value as we manipulate it, but just keep using the same name. So it's easy to use that way. And then finally, the last thing we'll do today is we'll be making some custom functions. And a custom function is just kind of a block of code that has a specific amount of steps inside of it. And then each time we say, okay, go execute this function, it'll run that function. So it's a set of instructions that is not run by itself, but it is run when we call that function. So let me show you what I mean. So to make a function, we use the command function. And then we can just make up any name we want. I'm going to call it my function. I'm going to open and close some parentheses to make it a function. And then JavaScript is a little long-winded when it comes to all of its syntax and punctuation. But then we also need to open and close some squiggly brackets like that. And I'm actually going to open those up because the actual body of the function, all of those statements need to go inside of it. So now we can do something like this. We can just put a console statement inside of this. I'm going to save and just refresh my page quickly. And now we can see this isn't being executed, even though when I load my page, JavaScript is kind of read in top to bottom, but we don't see it in my console. But what we need to do is this is just kind of defining a function. It's just saying what will happen when we call it. But now we actually need to call the function. To call a function, we just put the function's name like this. And now we can see this is it being defined, but now this is it being called. So when Chrome gets to this step, it says, okay, let me go execute my function. So then it hops up to this line and it reads all the statements inside of it. In this case, just a console.log with the hi message in it. And we can see the use of this is that if we call something multiple times, let me update my page again. We can execute this twice without the need to actually write out this code twice. And that's really useful when it comes to coding like that. So that's some basics of JavaScript. You can see it's a little syntaxy, lots of punctuation things, not quite as simple as HTML and CSS, but it won't be too much complicated beyond this. I'm going to go ahead and delete this just to leave myself space that you can keep it. And we'll move on to exercise 1. So let's talk about what we want to do with this page, actually. So we have a lot of input options, but none of the buttons do anything yet. But what we want to do with this page is anytime we change something, we want to change this demo box. So if I change this to kind of this pinkish, I want to be able to click this and have this change to a background of pink. If I change this to hello and click change. I want that to say hello. We'll tweak this as well, and some additional examples down at the bottom. But that's essentially what we want to do. We want to update this page based on some data we put in, and then clicking on these buttons to say we want to go ahead and go with that change. Okay. So in the beginning, I'll just have to teach you a couple kind of JavaScript functions and kind of the notation. But then once we do a couple examples, we'll see we have a nice toolkit of things that you can use again and again in a million situations. Even though they might look a little complicated in the beginning, we can just keep using these again and again in a lot of ways. So to begin, we talked about JavaScript. You can get stuff, modify stuff, add, delete. So let's begin by not even going to this box. Let's get a hold of this demo box, because eventually we'll want to modify it in some way. So we need to make a data object. We will be pulling something out of the DOM and kind of holding on to that so that when we do something later on, we can say, I have this data object in hand. Let me do something to it and change the website. So to make an object, I'm going to say demo equal. So that's basically saying let something called demo be equal to, and now I need to kind of get a hold of this HTML box. And to do that, we need to say, okay, let's access the document. That's just the web page of the DOM. I'm going to use this thing called dot notation. I'm just going to put a dot and then go on with my subsequent statements and functions. And then I'm going to say get element by ID like this. And I have an open close parentheses at the end, so you can tell it some function. So we know it's going to do something. And then I can end in a semicolon. And I'll just mention at this point, JavaScript is case sensitive. So you need to have the capital E, capital B, capital I. This probably won't help you. But if you want, you can just watch and then you can go back and practice on your own. As you can imagine from this is going to find something in the DOM with some given ID. So if we look back at the document, we can see the way I've made this. I found my demo box and I actually gave it an ID of demo itself. So in this box, I'm just going to say demo like this. So we can hope I now have this in hand. And we can actually check that. We can say console.log demo. And if we look at the console, instead of printing some specific statement, we printed out the object itself. We can skip all these kind of mean looking messages. Down at the bottom, we can see I successfully got a hold of what I wanted. I see that div ID equals demo, and then the text is demo box. So I have that in hand just with this simple line. I just get something out of the document using that ID as an identification. Those IDs, and we can also do it with classes if we want, but ID is unique, so we'll be using those today because it's less difficult to just find one single thing and do something to it.
Matt, I just have a quick question.
Yeah.
Can you also use the console tab right underneath it instead of using the inspect?
This one?
Yeah. Does it matter which one, right?
Yeah, you can. Yeah, looks like you can use that one. I didn't even notice that one. I just used the, I guess I used the complicated one. But yeah, okay. Go ahead and try that one if you want. Okay, that's like a CodePen one itself. This is what you can do on any website.
Right.
But yeah, go ahead and use that. It seems less complicated. Thanks, John. So we grabbed a hold of the demo box, and since we'll be modifying that with each of these boxes, we'll be using that a lot. But now let's grab hold of something else. In this case, we need to grab hold of this change button, because anytime we click it, we want to be able to know if it's being clicked on. So let's make a new object. I'm going to say I'm just going to call it color button like this. I'm going to use my same function. I can use it again. But this time, we use a different ID. And this ID, if we take a look, is the ID of this button. This HTML element has this ID. So now that's what this object is. And then the last thing we need to do is we have it in hand, but we don't know how to tell JavaScript to do something when we click it. So we need to kind of listen to if we do anything with that button on the page. We needed to know when we actually click on it. So what we can do is we can say on this object, and we can just name the object as we made it. And then we say add event listener like this. So it's basically gonna listen when some event happens. And the event in this case is just a click. So we'll say click, comma. And then what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna name a function that I haven't made yet, but this is the function that's gonna execute when I do the click on this button. So what this is doing is it's just listening anytime I click on this, go ahead and execute this function. So then I can say function, change color like this, got my function. And let's just go ahead and test it. So do a little quick check. I'm just going to put a little hi statement in. And we can see now, anytime I click on this button in my console, I can see I've clicked on it 5 times, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 15 times. So we can see we set this up successfully. All we need to do to get something as complicated as listen to a button and change something is just say, hey, JavaScript, listen to this HTML element. When I click on it, that type of event, execute this function, and then we just have to define the function and put any custom statements in that we want. So not too bad. We can take this out and then swap it out with what we actually want to do. The code to make it, take this shade of pink and then update this box. So we've done half of what we need. We got all the objects we need. We listened to the click. Now we just need to kind of change some CSS on that demo box in JavaScript. So what we need to do is we'll make a new object. And what we want to do is be able to get this, this shade of pink that we choose, or get this shade of yellow. We need to kind of get that in hand as kind of a JavaScript value. Oops, hang on a second. Okay. I wasn't allowed to type a second. Okay. So again, we need to look on the document, the website. We need to get some element by ID, same thing as last time. We'll just leave this blank, finish with a semicolon. And what we want to do now is we want to get this object. Because if we take a look at it, this little picking box, that is this input type equals color like this. And we can see it has a attribute of value. In this 90 EE90 is actually the shade of green. That's a hex value. So if we change this on the actual web page, even though this doesn't change on this side, in the document object model, this will change as we change this. So let's go ahead and steal the ID from it. This is that ID. So now we have kind of this whole thing as this object. the next step we need to do is we'll say let hex, as in the hex value, meaning the shade of the color that we have, is going to be equal to this whole object's value. So I need to say this whole object dot value like that. Pretty simple. Just a couple steps. We have to find something, then find a specific component of it like that. We can test out what we have by just logging that hex object. And we can see as I click change, I see that 90 EE90, which is the default one. But now when I go ahead and change this to like a red, we can see it changed to red. So in the document object model, the value itself changed like that. So now I have all that we need, and we just have one single step left to change this box. So now we have the hex in hand, and we just need to say, I have demo as an object. I'll be using this again and again. I just need to name my object. I'm going to say do something to demo. I'm going to say do something to demo style. Do something to demo's background color like this. And I'm going to set it equal to hex. And ahead of testing it, I'll just point out one thing. In CSS, we have something, like this. In JavaScript, we don't use hyphens. So instead, we take away the space and then we just capitalize the next bit. So that's why this doesn't match the CSS. It's just different syntax. So just watch that and try not to be, confused about it. It is different, but you'll just have to get used to it. So let's go ahead and test this. So let's choose some yellow. We'll click change, and we see it is quite good. We can keep going, do anything we want. So that one's all good to go. We can see comments aside, it only took less than 10 lines of code to do that. Not too bad. We'll do a second example, mostly the same stuff, just to get the practice down. So this case, we'll take a look at this button, and this CSS quality, it basically rounds off the edge. So instead of a 90-degree, it does a nice rounded edge like that. And with this one, it's going to look like this. So you can see this is affecting the CSS of this demo box, the edges of it. So we want to get this effect to come on. So we can just put a bunch of space. And then we just need to do the same things again. So we need to grab a hold of anything that we need. We'll need to add an event to listen to an event. And then we'll just make a custom function to take all that stuff that we have in hand and apply the changes. So we'll make a new button, a new object. And that's just the object is going to be this button itself. I'm going to say, go into my document, get element by ID. If we take a look at my HTML, let's go find it. We can see the ID that I took is actually the whole encapsulating element. I didn't grab this single sliding thing itself. I grabbed the kind of whole element itself, and we'll see why in a second. I grabbed the whole thing instead of just this by itself. But we'll go ahead and do that. Step 2, we'll just say on edge button, add a listening to an event. And this time, instead of click, I'm going to put input, and we'll see why in a second. But then as my second step, we define that function, that thing that will execute when we do something to this element that we have. So I'll say change edge, and then I'll end in a semicolon. And then let's go ahead and define that function that we just named above, but that doesn't exist yet. Kind of space it out like this. And we'll just put a little test statement in to see if we have what we want to begin with. Okay. So now take a look at this one. We can see this is executed like 150 times now. It's executed 200 high statements. And that's because instead of click, I put input on the whole thing. So instead of like with this one, when we changed it and it just changes when we submit it, well, this one doesn't have a submit button. So basically anytime we input to this input element, it's going to automatically and instantly update it. So that's why each time I go down one, we can see it prints a new high statement. So this is just a way to automate it, and we don't even need the submit button at this point. So now the last thing we need to do, we know that we have demo as the object demo. We just need to grab this value. We need to get this 21 when we set it. So we'll say let new edge equals, and then we'll say go into the document, the DOM, get element by ID, open and close that. And then let's go take a look at what ID that we need. We can go into the HTML. We can see this slidey thing looks like this guy. And so we can grab onto this ID edge slider like that. Edge slider like that. Let's go ahead and print this out to see that it is what we want. Okay, so we can see each time I do it, it's automatically updating. But we can see, let's wait till this catches up. I have the whole element in hand. I don't just have the value in hand. I have the whole thing in hand. So we could do something like this. So I'm going to say new edge is now going to equal just new edge's value. I don't want the whole element. I just want that one specific attribute of it. I just want its value because I just need that one piece of data in hand. So now when I go to my page, I can see it's nicely printing in the console the value, each and every value as I change the slide like that. And now just one last step to change it. We just need to say, let's go back to demo. I'm going to go to its style. I want to change its radius. And I want to change it to this new edge, which again is just the value at this point. If we had set it equal to new edge without this line, it would be set equal to a whole HTML element, and then we would have a JavaScript bug, it would crash. So we need this line to get just the value. And again, just like last time, CSS looks like this, but JavaScript looks like this. It's actually called Camel Case because you have, each time you have a new thing, instead of having a space, we're having a hyphen, you capitalize it. So it's kind of like the humps of a camel. So that's just a JavaScript syntax thing. Let's see. Okay, so it looks like, let's try and do it. It's not doing it. And we don't have any bugs. So let's take a look at what we did. We know the page. We know we have the correct value in hand because we have this log statement in. But if we think again about CSS, when we do the radius, we would have to do something like this. But what we've done is basically said, we haven't described any units on it because this type of style can take different types of units. So we need that pixels in it. So what we can do to fix this bug is we'll say the radius is going to equal this value plus tacked onto the edge, just the text px like that as in pixels. So now if we go ahead and do it, we can see that fixed the bug that we had. And that just came as a result of a little confusion between switching between CSS and JavaScript and HTML. And that's just something we'll have to get used to. That's a little bit of a pain dealing with 3 languages at once, but it's not too bad. And you can find these questions online. If you run into a bug, you can just Google, why is this happening to me? And a million people online will have had the same thing happen to them, and they'll let you know on some website when people discuss coding problems like that. So we can see quite easily, we've done quite a lot with this page. We got these 2 buttons. We'll now go back to this one. We want to be able to update the text in this box using much of the same techniques. Do we have any questions, by the way, yet? Feel free to ask. I hope not to go to the absolute end of class. So if you have questions in the middle, do go ahead and ask, by the way. Okay. So we'll do the same steps again. We want to grab a hold of an element. We can see it has a button again. So we might want to click that instead of doing it automatically like this. So we'll deal with that when we add the listening event to this. But let's go ahead and grab this element to begin with. We'll say let text button equal in the document get some element by its ID. And let's go take a look at what that ID might be. If we scan this, we can see this is my input, which is this box. We can see the value demo box. So this looks like it. It's just an input type text, and we can find its ID. So this is how we can identify just this element on the page. Go ahead and stick this back in. And then let's just add some listening to it. So we'll say on text button, add event listener like that. This time we'll click, since we have a button in hand, we'll say when this button is clicked, execute the function change text. We haven't made that yet, but we'll go ahead and do that now. And we'll just double check we don't have any bugs. This is something I always do when I'm setting up a new function or changing something. We'll just put a console statement in to check that we did it correctly. And it looks like it didn't, so we do have a bug. Oh, you know what? Oh, see, we did make a mistake. So I was looking at the input box. I was getting mixed up. We want to listen to the button itself, not the input box. So we can see I'm clicking on this input box and it's executing the function, but I want to click on the change button and run the function once I finish typing my text. So we need this ID actually. So you can see it's quite easy to mix things up. But even if you do mix things up, JavaScript is still going to happen. So you have to watch out that it's not doing something unintentional. Go ahead and replace that. That should fix it. So now when I click change, I get my little message. It's good to go. Okay. So now we'll say, just like the last two, we want to get the value, in this case, the new text that we put into this box. So I'll just call it let new text equal, and then we'll say go into the document, get some element by ID. And now that ID, now we want this ID. Now we want the element of the actual box itself, because then its value will be the text in that box. So now we want the value of the input field. And then we want to say, again, we can just say new text equals new text dot value, because again, we don't need the whole thing. We just want the value of it. And let's go ahead and just check it. I always suggest doing lots of checks in JavaScript. You don't want to write 10 lines of code, 20 lines, and then have to recheck all 10, 20 because you got one bug that you don't know what happened. So we can see I'm getting my, my value of this input box, and I'll just go ahead and change it. And we can see that I get it even when I change it. So that's good to go. I'll just mention at this point, we could make these guys into one single line if we want. Since we know that new text is equal to this whole thing, we could just do something like this. Just tack on value, dot value to the end of it. I'll comment out this. And now when I do it, it should do the same thing. It should grab my input box, but then out of that whole element, just grab its value and just set that equal to new text. So in JavaScript, you can kind of stack these up as you want. But if you want, you can kind of do it step by step like this. Grab the whole element and then just grab what you want out of it like that. And then the last thing we need to do, again, always kind of the simplest thing, just say, hey, on demo, let's change what's called the inner HTML. And let's set that equal to that new text, which we know that we tested on the side. So let's say demo.innerHTML equals new text. Let me change it to check it. And now we can see it does what we want like that. That's pretty cool. And we can even see if I put in HTML, it actually comes out in a styled HTML like that. So I could even put in like a link if I wanted to, just like this. And it comes out styled like that. So the inner HTML of an element is kind of like saying an element nested inside a second element. So like of this div, all the inner HTML is all of this. It's all the elements nested inside of it. So while in this case, we might just have text as its as the HTML inside of it. We could also have HTML itself inside of it, and then we have nested elements. So that's a lot we can do with this guy. We can kind of stack up and put new elements inside of that if we want. A slightly different way we could have done it, if we want to prevent that type of thing, is instead of saying that, we could have said, instead of saying it's HTML, we'll just say it's text content. So just plain text, no HTML allowed. I can update that. And now when I change this, it still does what I want. But now if I do something like this, it doesn't come out as HTML, because this is saying what I put in can only come out as kind of plain text. It's not going to make actual HTML elements like that. So in JavaScript, you have a lot of things to do, most of the same stuff, but you might have to take a couple second looks to see exactly what each of these things do and what they don't do. And then finally with this one, even though we have a change button, we could even, if we want, say, let's go ahead and update that automatically as you type, kind of like what we did with this one. So let's say document.get element by ID. I'm going to basically do the same thing I did up this way. Let me write this all out, then I'll kind of explain it out step by step. Let me just check that it does what I want. Yep, so now we can see, instead of using the change button, we can delete this change button if we want now. As we type, it automatically is listening. Anytime we make some input to this input field, it's going to automatically update the demo box. So what I've done down below is, instead of listening to the button and do something anytime the button is clicked, what I've said is go find the input field and then listen to it. And anytime we get an input, do the change text function, which is just above it. So now that we have this, this is kind of redundant. We can delete this HTML element if you want, but it depends on how you want to do it. If you want to make it automatic and quick, kind of cool, you can do it that way. Or else you can do the click button if you want. And we can also leave both of these on if we want to. That won't break anything. Okay. So we've done a bunch with getting a hold of elements, listening to kind of changes to those elements, and then updating some CSS and HTML. But now let's take a look. How do we make wholly new HTML elements and put them into the page? As of now, we've just kind of changed some HTML, the text content of this and the background of this. But how do we make like totally new HTML and pop it onto the page using JavaScript? We can see in this box. Let me pull up its HTML so we can see what it's doing. We basically have a select element. And what that is, it's just a drop-down field, basically. So we can see I have a select, and then my options equal the element that I want. And what I'm doing is I want to basically pick, I want to add an H1 to this page. I want to give it some text. I'll just call it title. And I want to be able to click this button and have it show up inside this box. And if I wanted to put it in H3 and add a subtitle, I could do that. And then I can also add P tags. So let's see how we could go ahead and do that. So let's just begin with all that we know. We just want to grab a hold of this add new button so that we can then listen to it. So we'll say let add button equals document.get element by ID. And I believe that one is called ID of add button. So that's how I can identify it on the page. So I'll say add button like that. And then I just want to listen to that button. So I'll say on add button. I want to listen to it. It's a button, so I will use the click, not the input. And I want to do some function. I'll call it add note. And then I'll semicolon to end that statement. And then we can just go ahead and make a function add note. And then we'll fill it up with statements that'll run when we click on that button. And let's just test it real quick. Okay, so that's good to go. So what we'll need to begin with, just like usual, we'll need to kind of probably get this value and then get this value, and then we'll need to do a couple steps to add it down below. A question? Okay. So let's say grab drop down and its value. So we'll say, I'm just going to call it element. So in the document, I'm going to get element by ID. And I believe, yeah, I want to pull the value of this select element. So its value, its ID is just drop down like that. So I got that in hand. And then let's say let val equals the value. So I'm just going to do this in 2 lines. With this guy, I kind of get all the HTML of this whole thing. But then with the second one, I say, no, I just want the value of the one that's selected. And we can see in the HTML, the value is the same as the text that's shown on the page. The value is H1, the value is H3 with a P tag, it's a P. And we'll see why that's useful when we make the element in a few seconds. But this is what we have at this point. We have something like H1, something like H3, something like P. That's what that value will equals. We have 2 pieces of data that we need to get into this one. So next we need to get the text that's put into this field. So we can say let note text equals, say go into the document, get some element by its ID. And if we go to the HTML, we can see this is my input field and its ID is just note text like that. So I'm going to say grab a hold of that whole element. And then I just want its value, what was typed into that box. So I'm going to kind of whittle it down at this point like that. And now that we've done a couple steps, let's go back and check if we have exactly what we want ahead of going on. We can put multiple things in the log statement. We just have to put a comma in between them. So let's go ahead, do something like this. And we can see in my console, it comes out like I expect. So if we change this, it comes out as we want like that. But we can also see we might have a bug coming up ahead because we get the data that we want, but people can still click the add new button. And as you can see, val and note text just have nothing in them because we didn't select these fields. So we'll keep that in mind as we move ahead. But that's okay at the moment. We can deal with them subsequently and not right now. Yeah, so we can deal with that right now. So we'll say use some logic to prevent input if drop down not selected and no text entered like this. Because if someone just clicks add new, we don't want to try and update the page because then we'll have blank data, stuff like that. So now we need some conditional logic, which is something that JavaScript has, and we'll use a couple times now. So conditional logic is just things like if else, if X, then Y, stuff like that. And it's kind of simple to use. We just say if. Then we put some condition inside parentheses. And then just like a function, we do some squiggly brackets. And this will execute if condition is true. So let's go ahead and put a condition into this. So we'll say if val equals nothing. And let's actually put something into this. So we'll say if value is nothing, please put this pop-up message on the page. So now we get that. And we also want to do a second thing. We want to say if note text is also blank, you know, people could have selected this, but then left this blank and click add new. So we want this pop-up to happen in this case as well. So what we can do is use these pipe characters. And the pipes basically say we have two conditions and they both need to be true. So we can say also note text equals nothing. So let's double check. We can say, actually, let's update this. So we can click add new, we get this pop-up. If we just select from the dropdown but don't put in text, we still get this. But now if we do both like we want them to, now we don't get that effect. So we've handled the exception, and now we basically want to say, if we get these bugs, we'll do this code. Else, we'll do this code inside this. So it's a little messy at this point. We have this if statement. And if these conditions come out to be true, we only run this code. But if these conditions fail, value is not false, value is not blank and note text is not blank, then we'll execute this code instead. And this is when we'll actually add the note to the page if we have the value that we expect. So this one's going to be the biggest. This is just kind of handling an exception with logic like that. So now we'll do something new. Instead of grabbing a hold of HTML elements, we'll kind of make a whole new one inside JavaScript, and then we have to kind of plug it into the page as we want. So we still need to make an object. We'll call it LM as an element. We'll still say document, but instead of get element by ID, because it doesn't exist, we say create element like this. And it's a function, so we put parentheses and then the semicolon. And then what goes inside of this, its input, is any HTML tag. So it could be an A, could be a P, could be an H1, could be an input, could be body if you want. So it just takes a simple little bit of text like A, P, H1. And now we notice this is why when I set up the class template, the values that I gave this dropdown are actual HTML elements. So now what I can do since I have an HTML tag name as a value, I can just say, let me take val, which was from the dropdown. And I could just do something like this. I'm going to make an element of tag type value, which is what's chosen from this dropdown. So that's why I kind of passed along H1, H3, P like that. Let's kind of see what this looks like. I don't actually know what it'll look like, but we'll take a look. So say H1 and we can see we still have this previous console in it. But we can see we made an element, it's blank, but it's just an H1 open, H1 closed, nothing inside of it. So we made a whole new element. It's just kind of floating in the JavaScript now. It's not on the page, but we have it as an object, so we can kind of do stuff to it and then stick it into the page when we want to. So we made the element. What else can we do with elements now that we made them? Well, maybe we want to add a class to them, and maybe we want to add some text to it. So we might do something like lm.classList, so access its list of classes, and then add one to it. And then I'll just let you know we want to call it note. Hidden someplace in this CSS is some style for the class note, which is going to help us see it on the page. So we'll just keep that as it is, and we'll see what that comes out to. And then let's go ahead and add the text that we grabbed into it. So we could say that elements inner HTML is equal to this note text that we pull out of the page. So we have the value and we have the note text. And now if we log this element, now we can see we have an element floating in the JavaScript. It's an H1. It has a class of note, and it has the text, hey, just like that. And now the last thing we need to do is we need to find a place inside the actual page and put it into the page. So what we can do, we'll say find a location in doc to append the element. And so we need to find the place. So this is the place I picked, this little box at the bottom. I think I called it, yeah, I just called it notes. And I put the HTML comment to be filled by JavaScript. So yeah, we'll use this notes box. So I'm going to say let note box equal in the document, get the element by ID notes, just like that. So now I have this in hand. And then my last and final step is to append my new element, which is just kind of floating in space, to the note box object that I just made. And it's going to come out at the bottom. So it's going to append it to the bottom of this. And we'll see what that means in a second. But we want to say of note box, append some child element. And a child element is just something that's nested inside of something. So if we have something like a head nested inside of it, that like indentation that we see is title. So that's what we mean by append child. Inside notebox, we want to put some new element. So append child, and then we just feed it the element. That's what that function needs. It needs an element to append as a child to something else like this. Let's go ahead and test it. I'm going to say, let me add an H1 with a title. I click add, we can see I get it down below. My class of note is just this kind of dotted line around it so we can see it. If I want to switch this now and say, hey, add a subtitle instead, we can see I'm appending it to the bottom of note box. So it's going to go behind this title now. And then if I switch to a p tag and I want to add a bunch, it just keeps stacking them up like that. So that's how we can add totally new elements into the page like that. And then kind of the opposite of that, how can we delete these? We add notes. How can we delete them one by one like that? So let's go to this. Let's go ahead and do the usual steps. We want to grab a hold of this delete last button. So we'll say let remove button equals document dot get some element by its ID. I believe it's called remove button. Yep. So delete last, I put some ID on it like that. So I have hold of my button. And then I just want to add, I can even do it on one line. Add a listening to some event. It's button, so I'll do a click. And my function, something called remove note, which I'll now define below it. So anytime we click on this, we'll execute this function. So how do we go about deleting stuff on the page? Kind of the same thing, but in the opposite direction. We want to grab a hold of this note box, kind of this whole green box that all the notes get stacked in. We want to grab a hold of that because that's kind of containing all of them. That was called notes. So we have in hand this whole box, and obviously it has the notes inside of it. But we got to do a couple things to handle it, because what happens if we try to delete something that doesn't exist? Like if we click this now, when it was blank, JavaScript might crash, it might prevent something else from happening. It's a quite finicky language, unlike HTML and CSS. So we want to be cautious about handling exceptions like this. So we'll put in a conditional statement. We'll put in some if. And we'll say something like if note boxes, we'll say this, we'll say if notebox.lastChild. And so what's happening in this? Well, I said that this is kind of the condition spot. If this evaluates to true, then we execute this function. And maybe if not, we go on to do an else statement. But we don't see a condition in this. We don't see like something equals something. We just see something by itself. And in JavaScript and most languages actually, something is true if it just exists. And we think of it as false if it's like kind of empty, you can't find it, stuff like that, if it's kind of null and void. So that's what this means. It just says, does this exist? Then we'll go ahead and do something to it. Last child is just kind of built in JavaScript. It's just going to find the last element inside, in this case, note box. So it's going to find the last note stacked inside of it. So we can say if note box's last child exists, then we can say on note box, go ahead and remove some child. And which child do we want to remove? That's the input that it wants. Well, we want to remove last child. Seems a bit redundant. We say last child twice. It's a little syntax heavy JavaScript again. A lot of people hate this language actually, but you have to deal with it. But that's how we can do that. And then we can even go ahead and add an else statement in. So if we try to delete something that doesn't exist, maybe we'll just put a pop-up and say nothing to delete like that. Let's go ahead and test the page. If we click on delete last, we get nothing to delete. Let's go ahead and add something, add some stuff back in. We'll just add a couple of these. And let me change up the last one so that we can tell what's going on. So if I click delete last, we should see the last child inside this whole thing, inside Notebox get deleted. And it does. And if we just keep clicking, we subtract the last one. We can do that one. And then when we get back to this point, we get to this else statement again like that. So it's quite cool that we have logic in JavaScript with just a couple, if else's, we can do a whole lot. So while HTML and CSS is kind of like stylistic and aesthetic, JavaScript is quite cool and you can actually like do lots of fun stuff with it. And then the last thing we'll do, we just have one last button. I'll leave this one undone just for the sake of time. But what we want to do is say we have a lot of elements inside of this note box. How can we delete all of them at once? How can we do that? Instead of making people click delete last. So we can go ahead and say, grab the button and listen to it. So we'll say, let clear button equals in the document, the element gotten by ID. This is the ID of this button. We can check it in the HTML if we want. And we'll go ahead and stack onto the end of this again instead of going on to a second line. Add some listening to it. When we click on that button, we'll run some function that we'll define in a second. And now what do we need to do now? Same kind of stuff we did with the last one, just one slight modification. So we can even copy and paste. We want to grab the note box. So we can say grab note box. And then we want to, let's say, let last equals notebox dot last element child like this. A new little attribute in JavaScript. But these things you just kind of pick up as you'll do a couple things online, W3 schools and free code camp. Just kind of pick things up as you look around. JavaScript has a lot of these kind of functions and things you can do. You just kind of have to pick them up as you go. But we can just access the last child of Notebox using this. And now we want to do something again and again and again without writing it so many times. So we saw we can do that with functions themselves. We could call the function multiple times, but we could also use what's called a loop in programming. And a loop is basically just a set of instructions that you execute some amount of times based on, some amount you say, like do this 10 times until some condition is met. So let's make a loop, and we'll say while last, like this. It looks a bit like the if and the else thing. We have while, this is a condition, and then we have a code that executes while last. And just like last time, this isn't a strict condition. We don't have like last equals something. We just have last. And again, that just means if it exists. So while some last child exists, we want to execute this loop again and again, top to bottom, top to bottom. So we can say, if we have a last child, go to notebox, remove child, which one? That last one. And now the one thing we want to watch out on is, again, this loop is going to say, let me execute statement 1. If we have a statement 2, if we have a statement 3, but then when it gets to the bottom, it comes back up, checks the condition, and then goes top to bottom, comes back up, checks the condition, goes top to bottom. So what we need to pay attention to is last is kind of set in stone. It was set up at the top. So we had notebox's last element child. So if I click on the reset all button now, last is going to this guy. And then my while loop is going to execute. It's going to say while last, well, this exists, is this guy. And then it's going to remove that child. And then it's going to come back up and say, last, does it exist? Well, this is last, but we just deleted it. So it's going to stop running this while loop actually, and kind of leave this and kind of leave us in the same position as last time when we kind of have to do it one by one. But if we just think about it, we can just say, hey, at the end of each set, let's say last is now going to equal the new last element child of the note box like this. So if I make something like this, and now, well, we can see it functions now, but let me set this up again. Oops. Let's run through the code just so we can see what's happening. This is the notes that I have in Notebox now. I get my Notebox. I get my last, which is this highlighted one. Last does exist. I have it from above. I'm going to remove this guy. So I'm going to delete him. Then I'm going to come back up, and the one I just deleted is gone. But now, after I delete that, at the bottom of the while loop, I'm going to say, okay, reset last equal to notebox.last element child. So I'm going to say, take a look at all of notebox and get its last element. Then I come up and say, okay, let's do it again. Get to that remove child. So now this is my new last. I delete that one. This is my new last. Come back up, delete that one. And now, since the last doesn't exist, we finish that while loop. So that's how we can do something like that. And I'll just show again, we have a bunch of elements, and we can just delete them all at once using that little logic like that. Okay. So I had one last example, but I'm going to stop now. But I just want to show you what it is and mention that we'll be taking a look at it next class, actually. It was already planned to be in next class. But I just want to show you now. This looks a bit like what we just did, kind of deleting elements. But if I click back on them, you could see the elements that vanished come back onto the page. But what I'm doing on this one is, well, with this one, I'm making new elements and then deleting them completely. With this one, I'm just changing visibility. So I'm just saying make one invisible and take up no space. Make two invisible, bring two back, make the last one invisible, make this one invisible. So we could do that too. That's just the visibility display CSS style. I just want to mention one use of it. We already saw today. If we take a look, this thing, when you click on something and things become visible and become invisible, that's what happens. That happens the same way that we see with this one. So in the handout, this class project final thing, that link is to this one with the code. So if you want to go ahead and take a look at it, you can go ahead, but we'll also take a look at it next class as well in the last class.
Matt, this was really phenomenal. Are you saying that last link that you just provided, the final, so we don't have to request this from you, what you just did?
No, I put it in the handout.
Oh,
so this link,
oh my gosh, great,
is the final project. So you have most of this now if you follow along, but you also have this little last bit of code at the bottom of the JavaScript panel.
Great, thank you so much. It's real. Oh, I love JavaScript. It's cool.
It is fun, yeah. Yeah, it's quite it's got a lot of things to it, a lot of punctuation and parentheses and things. So a lot of people find it annoying. It's a bit of a joke that everybody hates it, but it's amazing what it can do. Okay, if anyone else has questions, else you can sign off, and I'll see you next week, hopefully.
I do have a quick question. So last week I wasn't able to follow through.
Yeah.
Did you provide the same template? Did you provide the code from CSS?
Let me check if I included it. Let me check my handout. I think I did. I may have missed it with HTML, but I think I did. This is the handout and class template. I may have missed it actually, so I might have to send it to you if you want it.
Okay, great. All right, thank you. Great, thank you.
Yep. Yeah, I'll send that out too. Okay. Yep, go ahead and sign out. But if you have any questions, I'll stick around till we all leave.